And welcome again, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Prashasti, and you've definitely received multiple emails from me, so you already know me. But I'm really thrilled to welcome our fantastic group of panelists today, who will lead us into a discussion on immigration and abolitionist futures. And this is a part of the Immigration and Scholar series, and very exciting that this was one of our final talks. So if you haven't had a chance, I invite you to go review all of our previous recordings as well. And Immigration and is a new justice-oriented program that is open to everyone. And I'll drop the link in the chat once more so you have access to it. Today's space is a space of reflection and hopefully imagination. So we will start with welcoming our panelists and then be in conversation with them for about 50 minutes. We will end with some resources that I'll also send in a follow-up email. So if you see that the chat is popping and you don't have time to save all of it, don't worry, I got you. I will send all of that in an email. And I will also be monitoring the chat throughout our time today. So if you have questions, affirmations, or comments, feel free to put them in the chat and I will flag it for our moderator. And with that, I will hand it over to my lovely friend and incredible Leemah, who is the pro bono staff attorney at IRAP and will be moderating our discussion today.
Thank you, Prashasti. That was such a nice introduction. And thank you so much for having me. And thank you to our panelists and our attendees for being here. I want to start by inviting each of the panelists to introduce themselves briefly, maybe just like a minute or so in the interest of maximizing conversation time. And for attendees, Prashasti will be dropping links to the panelist bios as well. So there's much more to learn about the things that they're doing through that. Shirleen, would you like to get us started?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited for this panel. Hi, everyone. My name is Shirleen Achieng, pronouns she, her. I'm a Black undocumented immigrant who has been advocating on behalf of other undocumented immigrants since college, so for the past 6 years now. I currently serve as an organizer for the Haitian Bridge Alliance team, and that entails basically helping with campaign coordination that highlights the plight of Black immigrants, coalition building and community building with other organizations that are aligned with our values. Simultaneously, I also help coordinate and manage the Black Immigrants Bail Fund, which is the only bond fund that exists nationally targeting Black immigrants. And we just basically help them, pursue liberation by helping pay off their bonds. And so I'm excited to be here, learn from the other panelists, and thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shirleen. I don't think Angelica is here yet, Prashasti, is that right? Okay, great. Jamila, would you like to go next?
I'm on mute. Hi, I'm Jamila Hammami. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. Thank you. I'm on the steering committee of the Open Borders Conference. We're actually on our 5th year, so shout out, you guys should come through. It's gonna be great. Some of my Overton work, if you will. So I've been a part of that since 2019. And I'm also on the I'm also vice president of the board of directors of the Free Migration Project as well, based in Philly. So a lot of our work in that area specifically has been around shut down Berks and then other campaigns as well, ending medical deportation and other pieces of incredibly crucial work that often is not focused on as much as it should be. And then in terms of Open Borders Conference, the work that goes on there is really intersectional and honestly has grown to an international scale, and so I can't be any more happy about the work that I've done there over the last several years with a bunch of amazing other folks on the steering committee. So, and I've been doing this work around migration work, I apologize, for many years. I'm the founding executive director of the Queer Detainee Empowerment Project, and then shifted gears into school again, and now I'm doing this, still doing migration forever, I guess, once you come from a migrant in a family, so thank you.
Thanks, Jamila. That definitely resonates in terms of the perpetuity of the migrant work and experience. Cynthia, would you like to go next?
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Cynthia Rodriguez. I am a national organizer with Mijente. Mijente is a national Latinx, Chicanx political hub, organizing home, and we come out of the Not One More deportation movement. And we've been around for about the last 5 years. But I'm really excited to be here. So happy to be in conversation with folks. Before being at Mijente, I was a Mijente member for a few years, and I'm based out of and from Chicago, the southwest side of Chicago, where I've been an interfaith organizer and labor and immigration organizer for about a decade. So, yeah, that's a little bit about me and Mijente, and looking forward to talking.
Amazing. Woohoo, Midwest. Great. Well, with those introductions, I think we can go ahead and get started in our conversation. We wanted to start today's discussion by defining abolition, since as we know, there's a lot of co-option and misunderstanding of the term. And so I was wondering if one of our wonderful panelists could please explain abolition as a movement and abolition as an ethic, and perhaps delineating whether and how it's different from the defund movement. Shirleen, would you be willing to take that question? No pressure.
Sure. I don't know. I think for me specifically, for me, abolition involves undoing all the systemic oppression that exists. And I think what's really important to acknowledge is that this system is rooted in anti-Blackness, and that anti-Blackness is one of the most universal languages understood worldwide. And so for me, when I think about abolition, it really means unpacking anti-Blackness, because anti-Blackness is the root of the immigration system, the housing system, like education system. Everything is permeated and racialized. And so for me personally, when I think about abolition, it's really interrogating and thinking about, well, for us to get rid of all these systems of oppression, we have to start unpacking anti-Blackness, because Black people are the ones who are most impacted by these systems. But other panelists can feel free to chime in if they have other definitions. It's just how I center it, because I understand that the root cause is anti-Blackness. So
I'd like to chime in, and absolutely, Shirley, I 110% agree with all of that. Actually, I I see borders, I see prisons, I see all of this as white supremacy. These are all white supremacies. Like that's what capitalism and white supremacy. So I definitely, what you said resonated with me a lot. And, it's either, I mean, literally, I just think of like a border or a prison or even a school, an educational system, or ACS here in New York, but CPS where I'm from back in Texas, where I started organizing. Like all of these things, these are all just white supremacist systems, and they're meant for white folks and then for everyone else to be on the other side. And so for me, an abolitionist politic is recognizing that and then working to break it down. And I guess that's where defund comes in, right? Miriam Kaba talks about defund being like the floor. And I fully agree with her. It is the floor. It is the floor. I think it's a step towards abolition. However, I will say that I also, after Freedom Summer, which was just incredible, I just want to like really name that it abolition became co-opted by liberals. That's really what happened. Abolition became like a co-optation by liberals. And so all of us that have been in this movement doing this work for so long, suddenly we're hearing liberals talk about this sort of thing about, oh, it's abolition, it's this, it's that. But actually a lot of it was carceral feminism. A lot of it was all these different things that actually did not, and very anti-Black, like so anti-Black and out of control. So I think that when we talk about defund, yeah, it's an important and crucial piece, but it's just one step towards. And when we talk about co-optation, it's really critical, I think, also to think about co-optation of our movements, especially by those in power. Like, for example, those in, the White House right now, and the co-optation or attempted co-optation of the Black Lives Matter movement. And we've seen that throughout history with different presidents as well. So, and now we just see like a lot of like white liberal folks that are all abolitionists, but aren't really full abolitionists, I guess. So I think I hit some of what you asked. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. That was wonderful. And very helpful grounding for this conversation. And I think a lot of the things each of you touched on will be things we're able to delve into deeper with some of our more specific questions, but really tremendously grateful for that grounding to sort of frame the arena in which we're discussing as we go through these questions. And I think now we want to take that lens, that focus, that school of thought, that philosophy of abolition, and turn it to immigrant justice specifically. Jamila, you recently wrote a chapter on this in the Queer and Transmigration book. I was wondering if you might be able to begin to walk us through how we can bridge the movements for immigrant justice, for LGBTQIA+ justice, for abolition, and what the interplay between those things is.
Yeah, so loaded. There's so many pieces and facets to that. I think one thing that's really important to think about within the work that I've done over time is, almost every single person that I worked with, that's been queer or trans identifying has been Black or brown. As like a starting place, like it needs to just start there, okay? So like, for example, my family is North African, right? I think I actually talk about that in the chapter. My father's Tunisian. He's, so like through the liberation movements, in 1956, we were one of, the first of many, but then all of Africa went through so much with that time. Now, I give that grounding because when we talk about even, anti-Blackness versus like brown and Black, like within Africa, we see like a difference between how Black migrants are treated in the United States from Africa versus brown migrants that are treated from like in the United States from Africa. And I think that's very important to note whenever we talk about this, especially within doing that work specifically, because I did all this work with queer and trans folks. I think, notably, when we talk about bridging the two things, we know that disproportionately Black folks, especially, and brown folks are those that have to face the carceral system. Again, as I said earlier, I see borders, I see prisons, I see the carceral system, and I see ACS and all of these different, I say ACS because I was one of those young people that got funneled into that program and was working there for literally about 8 months before I quit, because I was like, wow, this is the most racist system in the world, and I had no idea as a young person, and then left and then actually went to organizing a school. Like that's where I went, and then started doing migration organizing and labor work. But I think that like these things are important to note whenever talking about the way that we're seeing all of these systems and how they interlock. So whenever we talk about prisons as a whole and we talk about migration, justice, and I prefer to say folks on the move at this point. I've kind of shifted the language a little bit on like, folks on the move and whatever that looks like, and the idea of freedom of movement, open borders and no borders, is that an immigrant prison is the same thing as like a U.S. prison, however you want to name it, however you want to call it. And the movements needed to be bridged a long time ago. And I think the fact that they're so siloed is such a problem. We see Beltway organizations in DC that still haven't been able to actually like embrace abolition fully. We'll see random think pieces here and there, but it's not like a full abolitionist politic. And I think that's really important to talk about, because queer and trans folks are disproportionately impacted by the system, right? Black and brown folks, but especially Black folks, disproportionately impacted by the system. And we can see that right now, for example, with Biden. And, at first he came out and said, we're going to let all these Ukrainian folks in that are journalists and queer and trans folks. Okay, one, don't pink wash. Okay, let's like be real right now. You just pink washed all of that because y'all don't even keep Black and brown, queer and trans folks safe here in the United States. So that's not real. Sorry, I get a little spicy with that one because every time I just think about it and I just get... And then in the last 2 months, I think about a week ago, an article came out, or a few days ago, that 10,000 Ukrainians that are undocumented, quote unquote, I also don't like that language, have already been processed. And there have been Haitian migrants, there have been Black folks on the move that have been sitting down in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands for literally years at this point, over 2 years. So that's really telling of, the reality of what the violence of borders and prisons are, because also folks are getting in that are Black or brown and queer and trans, because often there's a lot of intersection because of evangelical colonialism within Africa, within Latin America and Central America, etc. Then the result is that people are facing incredible levels of violence that really range. And so whenever I think a lot about, that was a long answer to a longish question, but whenever I think about these sorts of things and the necessity to bridge them, um, it's one, acknowledging the liberation of Black people is first, right? Like first, hard stop. And then second, it's also recognizing that the liberation of queer and trans people needs to, and also brown people, also needs to be the next piece. Because those that are the most impacted by state violence are Black trans women, Black, like, especially if you're a Black Muslim trans woman, like, especially, I'm like, I can go down the list of that, but I think that, I think coming from like a multiracial family, like on one side of my family, I have like Black, my siblings are Black and Arab, right? On the other side, that's not quite the case. So it's like this very interesting dynamic, but there's a fundamental difference of how we exist. And so, I think within that context and framework, and then also doing this work from so many different perspectives for so long, one of the things that comes up the very, very most for me is that until Black women, especially Black trans women, experience true liberation, none of us are ever going to have liberation. That's it. And so that means we have to abolish these systems of white supremacy, borders, prisons, all of the above, because otherwise there's nothing there, because these are the things that actually are creating the barriers for folks to actually move forward. One last thing, I think all the time about this woman that I worked with who was a trans woman who was Garifuna, so Black and Indigenous and a trans woman, and the just incredible linguistic violence she experienced, violence as a whole from, her own community coming here, the travel to the United States, quote unquote, like to the nation state, the experience at the border, and then whenever actually getting through the system, after being in immigrant prison, like what that looked like and meant for her. And then even whenever she got out and was over here and was stateside, no matter what, the violence was nonstop and never ended. And so it's really important to note that even if someone gets asylum, it doesn't mean anything in the grand scheme of if they're going to survive, for example, and thrive. Of course, it means something. I'm not going to discount that. I have the privilege of being the first person in my family born here. I'm not going to pretend that, I don't. But I think that it's really important and crucial to note that those pieces really do matter, and that's where anti-Blackness plays a role, and white supremacy plays a role, and transphobia and queerphobia. And I've been talking for too long, so I'm gonna stop. Sorry, when I go off on this, it's done. But thank you so much for the great question.
No apologies necessary. And I know you started to say it was a long answer to a short question, but it was also a very big question. So I think it was an appropriately robust answer. And I really appreciate, and I'm sure we all appreciate, the different ways that different examples you pointed to that are illustrative of those intersections of violence. And I think what we've seen at the US-Mexico border with Title 42 and Remain in Mexico, and the treatment of Ukrainians versus Haitians versus other groups is a really well taken example and illustration of that. So thank you so much for that. Before we move to another question, I did also want to ask Shirleen and Cynthia where they may see the intersection of abolition and immigrant justice in their work as organizers.
I mean, I echo everything Jamila said. That's how you're just now thinking, yes. Because I think specifically being a Black undocumented immigrant who's serving other Black undocumented people in detention, it really helps me put into perspective just how the intersection works, because of the double policing that happens of your Blackness, as we know in this country, is already policed, and then now your immigration status, and the fact that Black undocumented immigrants are 2 times more likely to be deported than other immigrant groups, even though we're not perceived as undocumented, quote unquote. And it's because of our Blackness. Our Blackness, there's a hyper invisibility within the immigration movement of Black people, but there's still are higher incarceration rates for us. And so thinking about how the mass incarceration that exists in this country goes hand in hand with, immigrant prison incarceration, because 44% of the people in immigrant prisons are Haitian, 44. That does not include other African migrants and other Caribbean migrants. So if I had to estimate, at least 50% of the people in detention are Black, but that is not in the mainstream narrative. That is not what is portrayed when we're talking about family separation. And that is intentional because it's an erasure that is happening. And so I think, yeah, definitely abolition, like when we're saying abolish ICE and abolish the police, both go hand in hand because both are policing systems. And Black migrants especially bear the brunt of that because they're doubly policed. And so there's a sense of policing you have to do on yourself while the world is also policing your Blackness. And so, yeah, it's definitely like abolition is definitely the only way for at least even for Black migrants to experience any sort of relief, because I didn't even know, but they do solitary confinement in immigrant detentions. And that's what I'm like, I need to even shift my lingo from immigrant detention to immigrant prisons, because that is what they are. They are prisons. And the fact that Black migrants are 6 times more likely to be put into solitary confinement, that the longest incarceration rates are all for Black migrants. I think the longest one was 10 years, and that was an African migrant. The second longest one was 8 years, was also another African migrant from my country specifically. So even thinking about just the ease of getting into the arrest to deportation pipeline. So I definitely echo what Jamila said, and definitely do understand, I think, holding that intersection, which has really been helpful in dissecting it, the importance of really abolishing all forms of policing, regardless if it's immigrant detention or mass incarceration.
And I would share 2 things, particularly about our work at Mijente. One is kind of like how we got here, and one is like where we're at now. So in terms of like how we got to this point and the kind of work that we do, that I'll share more about later in terms of our No Tech for ICE campaign. But a few years ago, when everyone was talking about sanctuary, we saw that one of the most really valuable tool that Black-led organizing, abolitionist organizing has created is the Invest Divest framework, right? And in that moment, Mijente was able to partner at that time with BYP 100 and create a framework that we called Expanding Sanctuary, that folks kind of took all over the country to talk about what are those places where we can really take on immigration enforcement and policing where they intersect. And so in Chicago at that time, for us, that was a lot of the work around getting rid of the gang database in Chicago, work that continues, work that is ongoing. And I think ever since then, if anything, what that work has unraveled is just the big, what we talk about a lot is like this big octopus with many, many tentacles of digital surveillance, of digital policing, of digital immigration enforcement. And so we're at a place now where we talk about the work that we do for No Tech for ICE as work that has a vision of abolishing ICE, that has a vision of not just abolishing ICE, but of really abolishing digital surveillance, particularly in the ways that in which digital surveillance as it's been developed through immigration is being applied and expanded through policing at large. We're seeing big connections between the data collection happening on the immigration enforcement side and, let's say, the privatization of policing. So for us, that's really where that intersection has manifested for us, and what we continue to dig in, as I said, as we continue to kind of figure out what are all these tentacles and where can we really squat up with folks to take that on.
Thank you all so much. That was a really helpful, I think, example of the different ways that these phenomena intersect, and also the necessary omnipresence of like the abolition and immigrant justice marriage, regardless of maybe what area of immigrant justice you're working in or focusing on, or what capacity you're doing that work in. So thank you all so much for that. The next thing I would love to hear you all talk about is this concept, as Mariam Kaba calls them, of reformist reforms. There sometimes tends to be tension between incremental reforms and abolition. And Mariame Kaba's work has pushed us to consider and resist these reformist reforms. And we'd like to spend some time navigating what that looks like within the immigration space. I know one maybe high profile example or big example of this is the strong movement within immigration to provide universal access to representation. And I think there is a question as to whether universal representation in the removal defense context is the right movement goal at this time. What is it at the expense of? Is it still worth it? You know, these big questions to wrestle with, and that I think people can come to different conclusions on. And I would love to hear from any of our panelists, their thoughts on reformist reforms generally in the immigrant space, on universal access to representation, specifically if they have thoughts on that, and just how you each decide which compromises to make, and if compromises is how you see it.
There's actually a really amazing quote by Mariame Kaba that I love so much, and it's so because it really resonates with a lot of the work that I've done over the years. But it's quote when you make a move toward abolition, you have to think about what it's going to bite, or how it's going to bite you in 5 years. Let's get rid of this, but what will we put in its place? And I think about that all the time, because I really, really love what, I'm sorry, excuse me, what all the panelists have already said, but specifically whenever we were talking about digital surveillance, right, and tech and surveillance, because for the longest time everyone thought, well, body cams are a great option for us to make cops be accountable, but in reality, what do body cams actually do? It results in actually the carceral system more, engaged. I'm sorry, more folks being engaged in the carceral system, excuse me, versus police actually being accountable. My words are a little excited. Thanks, ADHD. So that's a big part. I don't hide it. But that's something that I always think about. So, safer communities are not more cops with reforms. It's not more ICE. It's not more tech and surveillance. That's not what it is. The goal is to really remove funding from police. So, reforms that we should, support in the interim, are things that are, I would specifically say proposals in legislation to offer reparations to victims of police and their families, right? And there's actually a really great article by Mariame Kaba I'm going to put in here from Truth Out that actually really lays it out. But you can really easily adapt this to ICE, honestly, and to DHS, and to, excuse me, to CBP. Can't even speak clearly. But some of it, but it's not investing more funds that are focused in harm. And those pieces of harm are exactly what we were speaking about earlier, which are, specifically, providing more tech instead, well, we're going to get rid of this immigration prison today that's private. Well, not really private. That was the prison systems, but supposedly, but we're going to invest our money over here instead. Right. One thing that I think a lot about, excuse me, in this context also is that, whenever we think about abolition, we have to also think about the material conditions in which people are engaged in. So when we're talking about reformist reforms versus reforms that we, should actually support, some of those would include, for example, folks that are directly impacted by, I would call them migration controls, or are restricted, if you will, have a disproportionate level of substance misuse. And or abuse, however you want to kind of frame it, or use, right? And I say that because that results in the deportation pipeline as well. And that it comes up a lot in queer and trans work. And so that's why I really want to highlight it, because of the overlaying levels of oppression. And so with that, though, I think this is important to note, because often the state doesn't want to invest in programs that will support people so that they can not potentially be up for deportation. Rather, what they want to do is just grow and grow and grow. So some of the programs that we should be supporting, or reforms that we should support, are things around that, right? Actually investing directly in communities, directly into, for example, I'm saying substance misuse centers. And I'm using this based off of, my work, for example, for so many years. things that are really focused on the social good, but not things that are focused on how we can fund ICE, how we can fund prisons and these different, carceral controls, if you will. And, things that also disarm the police in the state as a whole, in my view. Sorry, I'm like, oh, I'm getting a little too, but yeah, honestly, the state, abolishing ICE and abolishing the police come with abolishing the state. So it's really like focusing on those sorts of things, and also data transparency. So stops and arrests, the budgeting of weapons and all of that. And that article is really great and really outlines what you should support versus what you should oppose. And so I want to go ahead and give other folks some time, but those are just things that I think a lot about within this context.
I guess I'll go next. I think this is a really hard one because for our organization, the Haitian Bridge Alliance, I feel like a lot of times we're responding to emergencies, especially with the work I do with the Black Immigrant Bail Fund and trying to get people out of detention and trying to figure out post-release help, like getting their flights and bus tickets so they can get to their sponsors. And so it gets really difficult because there's so much need for Black migrants out there, and and then there's very limited staff support. And so I think a lot of times I do tend to lose sight of, like, I know overall abolition is the goal and everything, but there's also Black, brothers and sisters who are in detention who need to get out, and I think even thinking about how recently Haitian Bridge Alliance just opened an office in Tapachula because of just the huge influx of displacement of Haitian migrants who are stuck at the US-Mexican border. And so, yeah, I think for me, I think one thing that's great, at least in my role, is I'm involved in other coalitions that support that abolition, framework, such as like the Welcome with Dignity campaign, which aims to reimagine how do we welcome asylum seekers without having to detain them. Because I do believe, yeah, the things also engaging are reformist, but it's also because the need is so urgent. And so, like, how do you find that balance when we know the majority of people stuck in detention are Black and there's nobody that's really doing anything to help that need? And so Black immigrant organizations have to step up. And I think that's really important to think about, because I think, again, unless we are also actively, relieving because of just the trauma that Black immigrants go through, and like Jamila had mentioned, and I really want to highlight that, just the different treks, and no part of the immigration system that Black immigrants experience is not rooted in anti-Blackness. Even if you're fortunate enough to trek through all those countries and reach the US-Mexican border, and if you're fortunate to even reach it, you're not allowed entry because of Title 42. Luckily, that's something that we're hoping is changing. And then if you've been lucky enough to get into detention, which is not even something to be lucky about because it's immigrant prison, you as a Haitian migrant are 50 times less likely to be afforded bond. And so it's like you're basically stuck there unless you're even fortunate to even get bond. And if you do get bond, you need a US citizen to sponsor you and pay for your bond so that you can get out. And so there's no step for Black migrants that is humane or met with dignity and compassion. And so I think for sure also engaging in legislative advocacy work, like Title 42 is a big thing that we were involved in, pushing the Biden administration to end because it's negatively impacting Haitian migrants, especially, and other Black migrants as well. And I think that is something that at least helps balance out the need while also staying true to the future goal of abolition work. So, but that's what I have to contribute to that. It's a hard one.
I also want to give a huge shout out to Haitian Bridge Alliance for all of your work on Title 42. It's been super important, and your analysis has been so needed and a part of how we're thinking, and really helpful for us at Mijente to think about the intersection between Title 42 and what's going to happen after in terms of digital surveillance. So I think for us, one of the things that we've had to contend with, navigate, is the conceptualization that exists around quote unquote alternatives to detention, right? And what that has resulted in, right? incarceration at large. And so there's a lot that has been exposed more and more, not just from Mijente, right, about the ways in which big data, big tech are fueling the deportation and detention machine, right, creating a digital dragnet. But at the same time, we're seeing support at different levels, and including bipartisan support, right, for quote unquote alternatives to detention. And by that I mean ankle shackles, a program called ISAP that Johanna Bouyan at the Guardian did a really great 4-part series investigation into. These programs are coming out, and in the last budget there's been a huge increase, right, in funding for digital surveillance, for surveillance programs of this kind. And so one thing that's really important to continue to resist in our work is demands that happen that say that surveillance can be created to work better, or surveillance can be more humane, or algorithms can be more effective. There's a way, Dr. Ruha Benjamin does a really good job at talking about how when we go down that path, policing becomes both more under wraps and also more expansive. I believe she says, right, that we create these reforms end up hiding dangers. And also a plug, Mijente's been running a 5-part course called Tech Wars. Next week is our last course. So if you want to tune in, you still can, or all the recordings are up as well. But we were really honored to have Dr. Ruha Benjamin join us for our last session, where we talked about policing and borders internationally. But all this to say that when it comes to incarceration, right, we have to be really clear about the machine of surveillance, and that these quote unquote alternatives are not safer, are not more humane, are not more gentle, but if anything are expanding and making more precise the ways in which ICE and police target our communities in ways that are ballooning and expanding, beyond anything that we had anticipated.
Thank you all. Oh, go ahead, Jamila. Go ahead.
Sorry, I wanted to do the same thing actually as Cynthia. Yeah, just shout out to Haitian Bridge and Shirleen, honestly, for all of your hard work. Without you all doing all of the work that you guys have done, honestly, I don't think we would by no means be here. But also, I just want to also just be very clear that white Ukrainians are honestly profiting off of the backs of all of the hard, incredible advocacy and organizing and labor of Black migrant organizers from Haitian Bridge Alliance, Baji, UndocuBlack, all of y'all. So I just want to give you a hard shout out, because I've been working on something and just constantly writing that because I'm just it's so true as I see everything flipping up and down, and I'm just thinking about you guys all the time and how much work you guys have put in. So I also wanted to give just a hard shout out for that too, because the work has been tireless and incredible. So thank you so much for all of your hard work with that.
Thank you, Jamila, and thank you everyone for those answers. And yes, as Cynthia and Jamila said, I think all of us who work in this migrant justice space have benefited so much from the work of Black migrant advocates and groups like Baji, like UndocuBlack, like Haitian Bridge Alliance. And so I appreciate the two of you taking a moment to acknowledge that and also spotlight the disproportionate benefits that some groups have been able to enjoy from that work, in contrast to the actual Black migrants, often at the US-Mexico border, who still suffer such disproportionate treatment in their efforts to get to the United States, so-called, and seek relative safety here. I think this next question is very closely related, and it may be that you feel you've spoken to it sufficiently, so feel free to say that. But I wanted to ask about specific considerations, if there are any, that you make or strategies you employ to integrate goals of abolition within your organizing. So Shirleen, you talked about the totally, I don't know the right adjective for it, but the reality of often being forced into a defensive and reactionary position of there's so much coming at the work that you're doing in the population that you're serving and that you belong to, and the necessity that creates of balancing helping the person right in front of you and addressing the need right in front of you, while also keeping an eye toward and a soul and spirit toward abolition. So I'm curious if you have any other thoughts you'd like to share on, you know, considerations and strategies that come into that. But if not, I think you've already given us such depth and richness on that topic. Okay, great. Well, I did also, Cynthia, you mentioned before the Take Back Tech and No Tech for ICE campaigns. I was hoping to ask you, in thinking about abolitionist organizing, if you could walk us through those campaigns and some of the considerations for rooting abolition within campaign strategy and working with different coalition partners. I think all of our panelists today have mentioned the importance of coalition partners, and Cynthia, you've already talked about, you know, what was effective with sanctuary as a concept and as a campaign. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Sure. So Mijente, a couple of years ago in 2018, began to lead the No Tech for ICE campaign. So No Tech for ICE is really work that comes out of what we were hearing from folks on the grounds in the community, right? And I'm like, I can corroborate this with stuff that I was hearing when I was doing worker center organizing, right? People were starting to ask, how is it if I've never shared particular kinds of information with ICE that they have certain kinds of information, or that people were able to show up to my home, to my workplace, to this other place, right? And one of the ways in which I saw that locally when I was doing work on the southeast side of Chicago and the south suburbs of Chicago, is that we had a community member who had two different phones, and there was a phone number that she was sharing with immigration enforcement and another phone that she did not. But it just so happened that one day she gave us a call to let us know that she got a text message from one of her officers to that other second phone that had never been shared in any way with immigration enforcement, with police, with the state. And so that led us to believe, right, something smells really off here. And there was a lot of conversations, a lot of consulting, and a lot of relationships, right, that Mijente tapped into to start to think through, well, what's happening here, right? And I know I haven't been introduced to Professor Angelica Chazaro, but you know, I know also, and really important to this story of No Tech for ICE, and thinking through these kinds of questions, right? And so what ended up happening is that there ended up being developed a framework for thinking actually about how data ends up in the hands of ICE, and particularly how that breaks down into 4 big buckets of digital surveillance. So those 4 buckets are data brokers, right, who's selling, sharing data analytics, how is that data then being processed and analyzed to actually mean something, right, in this case to immigration enforcement. Biometrics, right, fingerprints, facial recognition, and the cloud software, right, how is that information then being stored? And so through that, a lot of research revealed that immigration enforcement has this digital dragnet, right, that is expanding, that is growing. As I shared, right, the budget has increased for digital surveillance, and there's this way in which government, big tech, big data have not just a relationship, right, a working relationship, but also a revolving door. We started to see a lot of the players kind of alternating and back and forth between the different entities. But to create this digital dragnet. And so for Mijente, that meant starting to figure out how do we take this on, right? Because really the work of abolition, of abolishing ICE, is also then about abolishing digital surveillance. And so that's how we got to where we're at. And what we realize is that this machine of data, of technology, surveillance is so big that it requires us working at every level possible to take it on. And so the campaign has been really built out of working in a lot of different areas and with a lot of different people. So one area, for instance, is working with law students, right? Last year, over 25 groups of law students, different schools all over the country, did a really amazing week of action where they're taking on data brokers, in particular, taking on LexisNexis, Thomson Reuters, the two big data broker entities that have a duopoly, right, on data and are so familiar to folks, right, in law. And so that's one example, right? But since then we've worked with investors, we've worked with tech workers, we've worked with elected officials, with local community folks, particularly local community organizations, right? To build a project that folks know as Take Back Tech that we did with Just Futures Law, to really do even a deeper dive into the research and organizing around digital surveillance and immigration enforcement. And so there's something that's been learned from organizing in all of those different spaces. But right now, we've reached a point where people are talking about data in a way that is more mainstream than ever. I don't know if folks tuned in, but John Oliver just did a segment on data brokers. And so it's on folks' mind more and more, but really the work of abolishing ICE, abolishing police is also about digital surveillance. And I think it's really important, for instance, to really see how all of these everything that's happening is connected, right? We're seeing the end of Title 42 coming, and that's going to mean so many things, but also what is that going to mean how is that going to mean an increase in quote unquote alternatives to detention, right? And folks being placed into these predatory surveillance programs like ankle shackles, like ISAP. And how does that mean that we're, in a quote unquote different frontier of policing, and what does that mean for our response? So if anything, we've got to buckle down on the kinds of coalition work that we're doing and the kinds of ways in which people are targeting this big system with so many tentacles at every level, from professors to law students, to tech workers, to investors, to community organizers and folks, doing work on the ground. So that's a little bit about the campaign, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. That was super helpful. And I know many people on this call join me in our gratitude for the admittedly ground up work that many have had to do to get data and digital surveillance into people's minds and understandings of abolition and, the necessary connection between those pieces. So thank you so much for talking to us about how you've approached that. Next, I wanted to welcome Professor Chazaro, who's been able to join us. Professor, welcome. We were just discussing a little bit ago this concept of resisting reformist reforms. And we wanted to invite you to share some of your recent work on this big question of universal representation in the immigration and removal defense context specifically, and whether that's the right movement goal at this time. And we'd also love to hear your work on and thoughts on, tangible ways to bring about or move toward the end of deportation, ending the need for deportation, So we would love if you'd be willing to walk us through some of your analysis on these questions. And thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you all so much for hosting these really fantastic conversations, and bringing together so many great people. It's really an honor to be part of this. So, one thing I've been thinking about a lot recently is this question about, is pushing for federally funded counsel for all immigrants facing deportation the right goal, right? And it's what some people usually call universal representation. And I've moved away from that language for a couple of reasons I'll explain in a sec. But basically, you know, most pro-immigrant advocates and scholars, for them, the answer is obvious, right? Like more lawyers for immigrants would mean more justice for immigrants. And thus the federal government should fund such lawyers, right? There should just be federal funding for immigrant representation. I've fallen on a different line and really do see this now as a reformist reform because in part, you know, we call it universal representation, but really we have to deal with the fact that at this point, the majority of expulsions and deportations are happening outside of immigration courts, right? So outside of that moment when you could even benefit from a lawyer if you did have one, right? So most expulsions and deportations are totally impervious to immigration lawyering. Right now, we're starting to see the end of Title 42, you know, the practice of expelling people before they could even enter. But you can think of like the more than, I think it's like we're up to 1.5 million people who were expelled under Title 42, even if there had been universal representation, that wouldn't have helped them, right? That federally funded counsel wouldn't have helped them because they never had that moment where they could even get to a lawyer, right? Even for those who do make it to lawyers, you know, immigration judge assignment, geographical limits, and then just like the vast limits on deportation relief mean that most people, you know, the best case scenario, even if when we have places where most people are represented by lawyers, well more than half of people are still deported. And so I think the question I've been asking is like, what do we win if we win federally funded counsel for immigrants? And I think what we might win is just like cover for the immigration system, because still more than over half of people will be deported, but those deportation will be justified as comporting with due process. And so I have a piece I just wrote on this that I'm calling due process deportations, because that's what it really feels like to me, right? I think the other thing I really want us to be thinking about when thinking about, you know, is this a reform we want to pursue, is looking at history. So we think about Gideon v. Wainwright and the guarantee of counsel in the criminal realm. That guarantee, you know, that's now over almost 60 years old, coincided with the massive growth and the development of mass incarceration. Obviously, one did not cause the other, but there was no contradiction between growing to have the biggest incarcerated population that the world has ever known and guaranteeing counsel to folks in that system, right? And so I worry that we could expand federal funding for counsel and that could coexist very comfortably with a vastly expanded deportation infrastructure without any contradiction, right? And so, you know, I also am worried about the sorts of restrictions of funding that might come. Like we know once we ask the federal government to fund something, that's going to come with limitations. So for like any law students who have worked at legal aid offices or are thinking about it, you know, there's tons of limitations there where you can't do class actions, you can't do lobbying, you can't do the kinds of campaigns that Cynthia and Mijente are doing and talking about, right? You are limited to doing individual representation if you want to receive funding for civil legal aid, which is what this would be, right? And so why would we tie our hands to do that kind of advocacy by receiving that kind of funding? So the second part of your question of like, well, what are the campaigns? What should we be doing? I'm not saying in any way that we should not have immigration representation for folks. In fact, I think having like local governments and state governments funded can set up a really interesting and productive clash between local governments and federal government practices that can be helpful for moving us forward, right? But I'm thinking more, you know, like this week we're seeing, you know, I just saw a call to action. Etowah, a detention center that is one of the worst in the country that people have been fighting to shut down for decades at this point, is finally shutting down, right? And so what if immigration lawyers, every time we see an announcement of a detention center shutting down, are pouring into that detention center to make sure every single person there is represented, and so that if they're transferred, the representation follows them, or hopefully everyone can have as many bond hearings as possible and get bonded out, right? Like what if we say, yes, we're going to like flood immigration detention centers with organizers and activists to shut them down and to pull the people out who are going to end up in that detention center on the day it's shut down, you know, reduce the harm that comes from the shutdown action, right? So I think that's part of it, is thinking strategically about shrinking the number of people who will end up in detention, which we know is a prerequisite for many folks for deportation, and then flooding immigration lawyering in that direction. I think the other thing is like continuing to interrupt the pipelines. So like interrupting, ending gang databases, ending agreements between state governments and the federal government to transfer people from prisons to ICE, right? Like in many parts of the country, at least in blue states, we've won the fight of like local authorities should not cooperate with ICE, except for prisons, right? There's still a way in which even like our blue state governors are saying, yeah, except for the prison population, we're totally fine with you transferring them to ICE. So I feel like that's where our attention needs to be, because to me, those are the fights that are going to end deportation, because once we have won those fights, that will mean that our local and state governments are recognizing the value of the people who are most likely to be targeted by ICE, who are folks with criminal records, right? And so if we win that fight, then we have come a long way. So I'll pause there.
Thank you so much for that. And I speak for all of us, I think, when I express gratitude for the really like helpful explanation of this perhaps mismatch in where legal representation or legal assistance intersects with or enters like an immigrant's experience with our legal system and our deportation system, and your emphasis on being strategic about what we validate and how we actually maximize the harm reduction for those immigrants who are in detention or are bound for a pipeline to it is just so interesting, and so grateful to hear you talk about that. And I can't wait to read more of your writing about it. I think that, I guess I should say, I know that so many people on this call or people who will watch this recording of the panel later are excited about this work and engaged with it and want to take part in disrupting the status quo and re-envisioning like what our world could look like. And so we want to make sure we make time for a little bit of dreaming. So much of work in this space is offensive and defensive, and I think it is for all of our sustenance and ability to keep working that we create time for dreaming. And so, Jamila, within that context, I was wondering if you could talk about upcoming work on climate migration and border abolition and how we facilitate our organizing or dreaming to be truly global.
Yeah, and I'll be quick because we are at time and I know everyone has to get back to work from lunch. So yeah, I mean, a couple of things. I live in Brooklyn. Sorry, guys. Sirens. So always, every call. So, yeah, I guess I want to start off with, saying like the Open Borders Conference, for example, is such a crucial space. This space is such a crucial space. Like any kind of space that we can create where it's community of like varying kinds of folks that are within this movement, whether you're legal, an organizer, you're, whatever, a student, what have you, coming together to really think about and dream like what it could look like for us to not have deportation anymore, to not live in this sort of like world where we fear that our neighbors or our family members, right, or whomever could be just, or ourselves could just be, taken away, is important. I think that, Open Borders Conference, and I'm not just doing this to plug it, I'm really proud of the fact that it's gotten to this scale that, because, I mean, as terrible as COVID has been, it forced us online. And then from there, it resulted in like our first conference with folks coming from Nigeria, from Europe, from all over the place. And that was something that like, I don't think we could have ever anticipated. But that kind of experience is like where we hit this global scale of where we can really talk about what does it mean to open borders, what does it mean to abolish deportation, what does it mean to actually kind of dream beyond this kind of space. And this Overton work is like what's so important and so critical. In terms of like climate migration work, I think that really comes into play with the idea of abolishing borders. The reality is the abolishing of borders equates to an inability for imperialism. Like that's it, straight up. That means no more neoliberalism, ideally. That means there's no more maquiladoras. That means there's no more of like, varying forms of areas in Africa and Latin America, literally all over the global south, being imperialized for people working like pennies, for like the US dollar, right? That means that there's not climate destruction. That means that people are not in this position where they're being forced to be folks on the move. because of these things. That's what that means. So when I think about dreaming about it, I think about spaces like this. I think about Open Borders Conference. I think about any kind of way that we can really sit down and break these things apart. But also, that also means that we break down capitalism. And I'm just going to name that because like I'm in a space with OBC with a lot of people that are very pro-capitalist. And I just want to be very clear that as long as capitalism exists, we are going to continue on this pathway, because it doesn't matter, because people are still going to want to go and engage in cheaper labor somewhere else, even if we don't have borders, right? So I just want to name that also in this context. So whenever I think about, I'm speaking quickly, I know, but it's, so I apologize, but I think that these pieces are what's important. If we're talking about like how can we, facilitate our organizing around dreaming and be global, it's in making intentional spaces to have these discussions, and not just as people that are doing this work, but people that are actually directly impacted. People that are actually impacted by these systems of violence and oppression. And most often, a lot of folks in the movement are those that are actually directly impacted. It's not to say that they're not, but are their narratives always centered? Are Black migrant narratives always centered? Are they always at the table? No, they're not. Black migrants are not always at the table. Are Black trans women always at the table? No, they're not. So that's also a part of it. And again, I had spoken about the person that I worked with for a long time that was Gerifuna, she was Central American. So like what happened with neoliberalism, smack down, like the testing ground was in the region, and and that was sort of the United States and how they engaged. And so keeping that in mind and watching the destruction of this region and also of Haiti and like all of this area and how labor intersects with that, I think as long as we think about those things and we think about how we can ensure that everyone's at the table and we're doing actual dreaming that's collective dreaming, then we can actually be moving towards a movement of abolishing beyond just this idea of prisons, but also in immigration prisons and abolishing deportation is abolishing borders straight up, right? But that also means that we're abolishing capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamila. And I want to say thank you to all of our panelists, and I'll keep my thank yous much shorter than they could be in the interest of people's time. But we are so grateful to have had you all here to learn from and discuss with, and recognize that your willingness to be here was without pay and amid a pandemic and amid, I'm sure, an infinite number of calls and desire for your time and energy and attention. So we're grateful to have had the privilege of learning from you here on this call. Thank you to Prashasti for putting this together and helping us have a space for dreaming, like Jamila said. Thank you to everyone for joining. As a reminder, recordings of this session and then all previous immigration and panels will be on the website, which I'm sure Prashasti has put in the chat and will email out. And then I also just wanted to invite people to fill out a feedback form that will be circulated. It's anonymous, but we would really value, I'm sure, your thoughts on what you'd like to see next from immigration and. Prashasti, anything else?
No, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for sticking around for extra time as well.
Thank you so much for creating this space, and thanks to all the other panelists and folks that came.